So I'll introduce David Cruz from Barty & Parry to do our legal update. So thank you, David.
Well, good morning, gentlemen. Is it too late to say Happy New Year? We just had the Chinese New Year, so maybe it's not. We're off into the year of the pig, and some might cynically say, well, yeah, we're going to have this wonderful new strata inspection scheme, and that's going to fix all the problems, including things that happened over the Opal building in Homebush. So one might say that it's appropriate we're in the year of the pig because pigs might fly. Now, Dale has posed a few questions about this new strata inspection scheme and the bond scheme, and I'm very pleased that that's given me the opportunity to bring on my colleague Sharon Levy. Sharon's a senior associate in our commercial disputes section, so we work pretty closely together. Sharon, very experienced. She was admitted in 2002. She's done a wealth of building and construction disputes, particularly strata disputes. In a past life, Sharon worked at Bannerman's, and as a lot of you will know, Bannerman's do an awful lot of owners corporation work, and so Sharon's been at the coalface there. So I'm going to turn it over to Sharon, and she's going to tell you a bit about some of the legal aspects of the scheme. Thanks, Sharon.
Good morning. Thanks for having us here this morning. So I'm going to talk today about the Strata Building Bond and Inspection Scheme. So as Dale said, it was an amendment to the Strata Schemes Management Act, and that imposes new obligations on property developers in New South Wales. Under the new scheme, the original property developer, separate to the builder, it's an obligation on the developer, must pay a bond to cover the cost of rectifying any potential defects, and buildings must then be checked by an independent building inspector to determine the presence of those defects. So that's where you all come in hand. So when does it apply? It only applies to developments where the building has 4 or more stories. So when the home warranty insurance does not apply. It also applies only when the building will be used for residential purposes, so not for commercial purposes. It will apply to the residential portion of a mixed-use building, so if it's commercial and residential, it will only apply to the residential component. The building contract, it'll only apply when the building contract between the developer and the builder was entered into after 1 January 2018. And as I said, buildings which are less than 4 stories remain covered by the Home Building Compensation Fund, which as we generally all know it as the Home Warranty Scheme. So the amount of the bond is 2% of the contract value of the work. The bond needs to be paid to the Department of Fair Trading. If there's been no building contract, or where the parties to the building contract are associated, so where the developer and the builder might be one entity, then the contract price is determined by a quantity surveyor. And the contract price is determined at the end of the building period, so when an occupation certificate is about to be issued, as opposed to the written contract price, which as we know may be different to what it turned out to be at the end. The bond needs to be lodged with the Department of Fair Trading before an occupation certificate is issued by a council, and an occupation certificate, as we know, will be required before the sale of the property, or before it can be occupied. The bond itself can be paid by cash, bank guarantee, or any other form of security pursuant to the Strata Schemes Management Regulation. So Dale has given us a few hairy questions that we have answered. So first of all, the question was whether liability of a strata inspector panel or association and or the building inspector, what is their liability where they haven't identified the defects. So the Act and the regulations are currently silent about the liability of the strata inspector panel and the building inspector where the defects haven't been identified. That's all about to change though, with an amendment bill that's been passed that has not yet commenced. So it's been passed through both Houses of Parliament last year, so will come into force any day. But the amending legislation will protect building inspectors and professional associations from liability for acts or omissions done in good faith. So if an association or a building inspector has acted in good faith but has still missed some defects, that amending legislation will protect them. Where they fail to identify any defects because of negligence, then they will still be liable. Now, the definition between, or the difference between practically between good faith and negligence is questionable. On its face, good faith means to act with honesty and with sincere intention and an intention not to defraud others and to act fairly. So if you're acting without fraud and trying to do the right thing, then theoretically and technically you should be covered by that good faith exception. On the other hand, if you're acting with negligence, then they can still have a cause of action against you. Now the difference, as I said, between those two, the line is very blurred, and practically speaking there may actually not be much difference. Next question, what is the security of payment for the building inspector who's appointed by the developer, or if the developer hasn't appointed you, then the Secretary of the Department of Fair Trading can appoint you. Generally speaking, the costs of obtaining an inspection and a report of an inspector are to be borne by the developer. Whether or not the inspector has actually been appointed by the developer. So even if in circumstances they've been appointed by the Secretary, the costs are still to be borne by the developer. The onus is on the building inspector to ensure and to secure their payment. So generally the bond cannot be touched, and the bond is only to be used for the defects or any defects that are found to be present in the building. There is an exception to this though, and it's similar to the last resort insurance, and that is if the builder has died or has disappeared or has become insolvent, then the building bond can be used to pay the costs of the inspector and the inspection report. Generally speaking though, as I said, apart from those minor exceptions, the bond is only to be used for the cost of rectification of the defects. Once those defects have been rectified, or if there is no defects, then the bond will be returned to the developer. Finally, whether a developer and a building inspector would be in contravention of the legislation if both parties were members of the same association. So generally, if a building inspector and the developer are a member of the same association, they are not in contravention of the legislation. The Act just requires that the parties not be connected persons. Now, a connected person is defined, or some examples of connected persons in the legislation is that if a building inspector and a developer are related, or if the building inspector is employed by the developer or a business partner of the developer, or in some other way in an executive position of the developer, or has any other connection or association with the developer, then they are connected people. In addition, there are a few additional examples of when a person would be connected in this situation. And namely, that is when the building inspector has been involved in the design or in any aspect of the construction or the certification of the building work, or they're connected with any person that has been involved or otherwise has a pecuniary interest in the development in any way, then they would be a connected person. Just because they are connected people, it doesn't mean they can't necessarily be the inspector, as long as the owner's corporation are aware or the fact is disclosed to the owner's corporation and the owner's corporation still approves that appointment, then that's okay. But generally, just being a member of the same association does not then render you a connected person, so that you could still be the inspector even if the developer is a member of the same association. So that is our little spiel on the scheme. Does anyone have any questions on what I've said or any additional information?
What is the definition of a defect? For instance, if the inspector goes and finds some corner cracks, is that defined as a defect, or is it cosmetic things exempt from that?
No, so if anything doesn't form part of the, if it doesn't meet the Australian standard, so still, there's no special definition in the Act of a defect per se, it's still under the same standards and would need to be rectified if it doesn't meet the Australian standards, give or take the leeway that's allowed by those standards. It's only, and the question has been asked previously, well, what if the defects are more than 2% of the contract value? And in that case, unfortunately for the owners, they're back in the old scheme whereby they need to commence those proceedings. So the 2% will be applied to whatever the defects are. And then whatever is above that 2%, they need to claim from the builder or from the developer in the old way. So that in that respect doesn't assist. To claim that extra 2%, yes, because the developer isn't under any obligation to have paid more than the 2%. So in that instance, it will fall to the owner's corporation to commence proceedings in the usual way against the builder and the developer to claim whatever portion is left unpaid with respect to the with the defects. But in saying that, once so that in terms of process, within 15 to 18 months, the building inspector needs to go out and conduct the interim inspection. So they do an interim report within the 15 to 18 months. The builder is then given the opportunity to come back on site to rectify the defects that are found to be in the interim report. Then from 21 to 24 months, so between 18 and 21 months, the builder is supposed to go back on site and rectify the defects. Between 21 and 24 months, the building inspector then goes back on site and does a final inspection and produces a final report. And it's that final report then that comes out of the 2% bond. So one would hope that the defects aren't that bad, that at the final report stage they are still worth more than the 2% bond that's been lodged. The inspector would not inspect the commercial component for the purposes of working out what need to be rectified under the bond. And for the commercial component, the owners would proceed in the old way, so to speak, and have a report done with respect to the commercial component and then those defects rectified in the usual way. That the 2% bond does not pay for any defects in the commercial component. No, the whole of the building. The whole of the building needs to be inspected. The owners are required to give access for the purposes of inspection, and if they don't give access, then the developer is entitled to seek an order that access be granted in order to allow the process to continue so that they get their bond back by the 2-year period.
I sometimes do completion inspections or defect inspections when the builders at handover. So you go in and generally check on finishes and stuff on the standards and tolerances guide, the Australian standards for that. Sometimes I'll find the flashings are wrong, stair rises and things like that are wrong. While it's in that defects liability period, is it up to that owner to hand that then over to another body and say, well, this wasn't fixed during my defect liability period? Does that then excuse the builder from, if he drags that out long enough, he can then just rely on the bond?
So I actually think the changes will bring about changes to building contracts themselves. So at the minute, as you know, generally speaking, it's a 12-month defect liability period. One of the changes that I can foresee is that the defect liability period stretches out for 2 years.
Right.
To marry up with that exact issue. Otherwise, you do have this gap period of, well, the defect liability period has expired, now I'm looking to the developer to get it fixed. So there is a little bit of a mismatch there. I think that the contracts potentially could change to a 24-month defect liability period to avoid that. But in the interim, until then, it's not an onus on the owner to get it fixed within those first 12 months. So just because they haven't gotten it fixed within the first 12 months doesn't mean that they can't then get it fixed. It'll mean that if it's not fixed within those first 12 months, the inspector will come along at that 15 to 18 month period. After one would think any defects have been rectified.
I should advise my clients, if it's not fixed,
You
wait
can
until the
still,
other inspector comes around
yes,
and show it
absolutely,
his nose,
yeah.
say this is done.
yes. So the owners can try and get the builders to fix it within those first 12 months. If not, they've got another round of inspections to get it fixed. But ultimately, the developer, one would think, would be looking to the builder to go back and rectify up to that 24-month period. So for that reason, I would have thought it makes sense for potentially contracts to be amended to cover that, so that there's no gap there in liability. So it's released to the owners, and then the owners will go out and engage whoever they wish. So generally, you think that would not be the same builder, it'll be a remedial builder who'll go out then and use that money to fix it up within that 24, or once they get paid. It's a matter then of whether they can get it done for that 2% amount, or whether it's going to cost extra. Then it's a matter for the owners' corporation as to whether they want to pursue the developer and builder for the gap, if there is a gap, or whether they just wear that cost of whatever it is. And as I said, given that the builder has gone back on site, the developer has been required to fix it within, after the interim report, then it's a matter of whether the 2% does cover it or whether it is too low. And only time will tell. No, they only receive the value of what it costs to fix that defect, and then the refund will go back to the developer if there's any left over. You have to be qualified to be an inspector. So a qualified person under the legislation is an individual person, corporation, who is a member of a body in Part 8 of the regulation, and who may be recognised as a building inspector. So it's not just any Joe Blow who can be an inspector. That person must be able to perform the role of building inspector to conduct interim and final inspections and provide the reports as mandated by the Act. No other specific industry membership is required to perform inspections for the purposes of the scheme. So you do need to be qualified and a member of a body to be able to conduct the inspections, and if not, or if you're not suitably qualified, then you are opening yourself up to a negligence action, even if you have acted in good faith. So in terms of the conflict, it's okay if the builder and developer have a relationship. The conflict cannot be, or the connected relationship can't be between the developer and the building inspector. So in terms of often the builder and the developer are the same person. So that is okay, but there just can't be this relationship between the inspector and the developer.
I think it's a performance issue with Strata, it's fall back to this.
Except the builder has still got the warranties that he gives under the Home Building Act. So this legislation doesn't affect the builder's obligations under the Home Building Act and the warranties that he gives for that 6 and 2 year period. So the builder is still on the hook. Despite any of this, the builder is still on the hook for any defects that arise within that 6 year period for major defects and for 2 years for any other defects. Then the developer will need to get a remedial builder to do that work.
The developer has that obligation.
Yes, yeah. So if the developer wants his 2% bond back, the developer would need to find someone else to do the work.
And if he doesn't, he forfeits the 2%.
The full 2%, even
Yeah.
if it costs less than that.
So after the builder, as opposed to spending it on rectifying defects?
Look, I think I haven't encountered that situation. I think though that they are given the 2%, and whether they want to go and get it rectified or not. I would have thought if you were a builder or a developer, you would be saying, well, no, you've had 2% to put toward the defects. You can now only claim the balance,
Yeah.
whether it be, another 3%.
Yeah.
NCAT generally is a non-cost jurisdiction, so it means that if the owners corporation were to go to NCAT, generally they do not get their costs paid by the builder unless the builder's acted unreasonably. So generally, I think that 2% would be required to come off first, and then they claim the balance.
Yes.
The Department of Fair Trading provides, it does set out what needs to be in an interim report and a final report, and costings are referred to. So in that instance, if the building inspector, and there aren't many building inspectors who are also quantity surveyors, so in that instance, that would be one of the areas where perhaps you could go off and get a specialist report and say, as a building inspector, I can't quantify this. I need to get a specialist to provide a secondary report, and that would be the QS report. Regardless of whether the developer, if the developer doesn't get the builder back to do the works, then it just means that they're not going to get much of a refund at the end of the day. So it's regardless of whether they consent to that 2% or not, whether they've walked away or whether they appoint an inspector, the 2% will still be paid and the 2% will still be distributed out to the owners corporation.
There's no liability for them or no.
I don't know if there's a black name against them per se, a black mark against them per se. Okay.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Sharon. So clearly, even from the questions, you can see that there are still lots of holes in the legislation, lots of things to be fixed, lots of things to be thought about. Usual story, the devil's in the detail. It'll play out. I do wonder, in terms of the 2%, as Sharon mentioned, it may be that as the scheme starts to, I hesitate to use the word, but work, as we get experience with it, it may be that that threshold will be increased. We saw it with the home warranty. It started off at 200, it's now at 320, 340. Of course, what that increasing that threshold, that 2%, does to the cost of building, the developer's going to want to pass it on. Is that going to be passed on to consumers, onto house prices or apartment prices? We don't know. We'll have to see what happens. It may be that there's an economic consequence in terms of remedial building. It may be that there's economic pressure on remedial builders to make sure that the costs of the remedial building is going to be less than 2%. Because owners corporations may well go to them and say, well look, we need these things fixed, but we've only got this 2%. That's as much money as we've got. Do you want the job or not? So could affect remedial building prices. We don't know. We're just going to have to suck it and see, if you like, and see where we get to. But I think, and Dale's going to talk about this more later, I think it's a great opportunity for a lot of the members of this society. Because as Sharon said, to be an inspector, you've got to be a member of an accredited body. And so if the society can get that accreditation, then that opens up work for you guys. Of course, as John also mentioned, there's the liability issue. And so you want to make sure that your insurance covers it, or that you're very, very careful when you're doing it. And so really, I think from a commercial aspect, you want to be keeping your ear close to the ground in terms of what are actual inspectors out there doing, what are they required to report on, whether there are any complaints or whatever issues arise, so that you can then avoid it if you end up doing that kind of work. So thank you, gentlemen. I'll just leave you with this. As I mentioned, the devil's in the detail. We know lawyers are usually pretty good at detail. Sometimes they can be a bit too good at detail, or a bit too obsessed with detail. Apparently there's a Scottish lawyer at the moment who is trying to get an injunction in relation to what is described as his neighbour's growling toilet. This guy's a partner at a Scottish firm, could only be a Scottish firm, called Blackadder's. He says that the toilet in the flat above him makes an unacceptable noise because of, and I don't know, Chris might be able to tell us what this is. He alleges that the unacceptable noise is due to the installation of a grinding fan, which is some kind of installation in a toilet. Instead of just flushing and going out, it's a bit like one of those things in the sink, you know, the incinerator. Apparently it's they have them for toilets in Scotland, I don't know.
Well, but when they can't get gravity.
Right, okay. So apparently this loud mechanical growling of the offending apparatus said to be similar to the revving of a motorbike or a chainsaw. Apparently this, lawyer's very thorough. He's got an expert from who has come in and said that the noise is in excess of World Health Organisation's guidelines. And he says it's ruining his life and his wife's life, and so he's taken to creating a diary. And apparently the flat above, it's an Airbnb flat, so people are coming and going. It's not the usual. So he's kept a detailed, excuse the pun, log about the movements of the visitors upstairs. They include bathroom habits, such as arrival times, when they go to the bins, and their movements from room to room. He's noticed some patterns. So apparently American visitors go and have a shower as soon as they arrive. Women usually go to the toilet as soon as they get in the door. And so it paints a bit of a bleak picture. You can imagine this guy sitting there at his kitchen table at midnight, bug-eyed with rage and scrawling flush times in his notebook. So, perhaps that's taken it too far. Thanks, gentlemen.